Okay, so let's discuss this study. Sensitivity of the human temporal voice areas to non-human primate vocalization. And if you're going, huh? That's kind of what I said too at first. But turns out that this is a really exciting study and somewhat intriguing mystery. A mystery that sits at the core of what it means to be a human. We're talking about human speech. And this study provides us with some really exciting discoveries about the origin of speech by discovering something really bizarre when some humans had to listen to chimps making all kinds of noises. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Today we're going to discuss some really exciting discoveries in regards to human speech evolution and talk about some other discoveries from previous studies that we've discussed in some of the videos you can find in the links below. But I guess first, let's maybe establish the mystery and why this is so important. And that's because for a very long time, when we looked at the human ability to communicate complex ideas, it's as if this appeared out of nowhere. Because for the most part, we don't really see a lot of other species doing the same. But some of the recent scientific discoveries do suggest that there are certain echoes of a kind of a primal voice that seems to be present in our biology, but also the biology of our cousins, so some primates, such as chimps and gorillas, which is sort of what this study by Leonardo Caravolo and the team you see here from Geneva is all about. But first, I wanted to briefly discuss some of the recent discoveries in terms of genetics from slightly different studies, because in some sense all of this connects. Here we have to discuss two particular genes referred to as FOXP2 and NOVA1. And that's because we need to understand these genes to understand speech. Because basically all of this comes from our DNA. And for many years there was always this one exciting contender for the origin of speech. It was actually even referred to as the language gene, and it's known as FOXP2, forkhead box protein P2 to be exact. Its structure kinda looks like this. And this seems to be an essential gene for proper development of language in a lot of humans. This was actually discovered completely by accident when researchers were studying a British family referred to as KE family in a lot of studies. And here, for some reason, half of the members of this family had extreme difficulty communicating. They basically had a major speech disorder and were unable to talk almost at all. But following years and years of analysis, it was discovered that there was one genetic difference. It turns out that some of the members had a mutation in the FOXP2 gene, which made it very difficult for the members of the family to coordinate the mouth and tongue movements necessary for normal human speech. So here we had a direct connection between FOXP2 and the development of motion inside human mouth. But this gene is not uniquely human. A lot of animals contain it, and actually animals that we know kind of communicate as well. For example, birds also use it for mimicry, and bats use it for echolocation. But the human version has a few tiny differences that seem to have affected our overall neurodevelopment. Interestingly, when it comes to human cousins such as Neanderthals, they had an exactly similar gene, implying that Neanderthals could have very likely produced very similar noises and thus potentially speak as well. But this was based on studies from over a decade ago. Now there's actually something new and something that we didn't really know about before until recently. There's also a gene referred to as NOVA1. And unlike FOXP2, the specific variant of NOVA1 is only found in modern humans. It doesn't appear in other species such as Neanderthals and Denisovans, and thus potentially allowed humans to communicate in a very different way. And this gene is a kind of a master switch that regulates 90% of other human genes in at least some way. And actually one of the recent experiments we've discussed in the video in the description basically took this gene and decided to put it into mice, giving them the human version of NOVA1 gene, resulting in some really bizarre effects. You can learn about this in that video in the description, but in a nutshell, it made a lot of mice squeak and peep very differently. They produced a lot more of these squeaks, and some of their courtship songs became ridiculously complex. This was actually a really bizarre discovery, and I'm kind of scratching my head about it even today. And this of course suggests that NOVA1 gene might be a key factor in the synthesis of proteins that eventually form complex vocalization. We don't really know exactly how this is done yet, but based on these mice experiments, we know that it seems to have a major effect in producing human speech. But that's of course just genetics. Speech, though, is not just about genes, it's also to some extent about intent. Intent to communicate. Or basically, what's the purpose behind a certain sound? And traditionally, scientists have been kind of conservative about this assuming that animal sounds were just involuntary emotional outbursts. For example, a dog might start barking because it feels a little bit emotional. But recent studies in the wild seem to have overturned a lot of these assumptions. And actually a lot of this research you can even find right here in one of the links, where we have an entire list of different primates communicating, producing different calls that you can then hear yourself in one of the videos in the description. And so here we do have some really exciting discoveries even from as far back as 1960s. Here by studying vervet monkeys, whose picture had me distracted for a few minutes because, just look at this. That's, I guess, one way to attract a mate. We're also discovered to have extremely different alarm calls for different predators. For example, one for leopards, one for eagles, and one for snakes. And here, one of the first tests back in the 60s involved replaying a leopard call on a speaker. And though the speaker was hidden, and there was no actual leopard present, all of the monkeys ran into trees, suggesting that these calls carry specific meaning, or suggesting that they basically had words. But even more impressive is the intentionality seen in chimpanzees. Here, in a separate study involving a fake snake hidden in a tree, scientists observed that chimps were also a lot more likely to make the "who" alarm call if they noticed that none of their group mates had seen the snake yet. Or basically they would look at the snake and their friends or their family members first, trying to figure out if they also noticed the snake. And they would then start making the call, looking back and forth in order to see if the message was received. And this essentially shows scientists that they're not just screaming out of fear or out of emotion, they're intentionally trying to inform others of a very specific danger. But this of course brings us to this recent study that is way more complex and involves something that nobody actually expected before. And first, let's briefly discuss our brain. For a while now, scientists have known that our brains contain extremely specific areas associated with speech and listening. For example, there's an area referred to as TVA or temporal voice area. This area seems to directly respond only to human voices. And this has been tested many times when, for example, playing music or other sounds does not seem to produce any reaction, but once a human hears a voice, the neurons in these areas seem to light up. This was of course tested by using MRI machines. But the point of this research was to see if we can actually try to create these effects by playing sounds of different primates. Or essentially, can we produce the same effects in these neurons if humans hear some other animal? And so they played vocalization from humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and macaques. Here this was using 23 volunteers whose brains were monitored using MRI machines. And the discovery was of course striking. Turns out our brains seem to produce enhanced activity when we hear chimps. And this response was independent of low acoustic factors like loudness or pitch. Basically, our brains seem to be kind of tuned to voices of our closest relatives. But what makes this even more intriguing is that technically bonobos are also kind of related to us. Genetically, bonobos are just as close to us as they are to chimps. But strangely enough, our brains did not show the same sensitivity to the calls of bonobos or of course macaques. And at first it was not clear why. But this seems to come down to what's known as acoustic distance. Acoustically, the chimpanzee calls are much closer to human voices compared to bonobos. And specifically, the bonobo call is usually much higher in frequency and is actually a little bit more similar to a bird call than a chimp's call. And that suggests that our brain's voice processing regions did not just evolve to listen to humans. Instead, they might have evolved to process certain types of information and certain types of vocalization with very specific acoustic traits that we seem to share with chimps. So this actually points to a deep evolutionary continuity in how primates process social communication. And to some extent this of course, maybe, challenges human uniqueness. It kind of shows us that the foundation of speech seemed to already exist millions of years ago in the brains of our ancient ancestors that both humans and chimps came from. And so here we have a very interesting confirmation that we seem to share a voice system with other primates, or a system that processes social information through very specific sounds. But this of course doesn't change the fact that the genes are still a little bit different. We still don't really know exactly how they affect the brain and the evolution of vocalization, But both Nova 1 and FoxP2 definitely have unique variants only present in humans. And one day, once we figure out exactly how they work, this might actually allow us to treat a lot of different language development disorders. But the results from this experiment are definitely kind of exciting. It basically suggests that we're still reacting to the world in the same way we did millions of years ago. Or basically that our brain seems to remember these ancient sounds from various forests we lived in before we actually became human. And while we still have no idea how exactly all of these different pieces fit together to create the idea behind human speech, based on a lot of these studies, we're definitely kind of slowly getting closer. Which means that we'll definitely come back and follow this up with additional studies and additional videos sometimes in the future. Now on that note, check out that video about mice and human language gene in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support the channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.